Ever wonder why people get sexually aroused by kind of strange things, articles of clothing, inanimate objects, for instance, or why people hold exciting sexual fantasies in their heads that they often don't share with anyone? Could there be an evolutionary reason? Welcome to Mating Matters, the podcast that looks at human behavior through a lens of evolutionary psychology. I'm Dr. Wendy Walsh with producer Brooke Peterson. On this episode, we examine fantasies and fetishes. And like many of our episodes, it comes with a bit of a trigger warning. Besides some benign and even humorous commentary about the funny things that turn people on, we'll also be talking about sexual trauma and paraphilias that can get people into legal trouble. If you're a survivor of sexual trauma, please be considerate about what you expose yourself to. Only you know where you are in your journey of healing. Okay, with that said, let's get to it. First of all, most fantasies and fetishes are pretty normal, even if they sound kind of strange. My thanks to our listeners who shared some of theirs with us.
My name is Amethyst Spring, and I am a dominant in my local kink community, and I have 2 submissives under me.
Now, my particular kink is rooted firmly in the fantasy realm of shrinking woman.
What really turns me on is the thought of a lady with white lace undergarments and white pantyhose with white high heels.
So my fetish is boxing and wrestling with women. I always wanted to do it, and it took me a long time to actually get into my desires.
I miss the days when women wore nylons. I'm a leg man.
Right now, I'm engaged, and so something that will lead me to orgasm or, get me turned on is thinking about us having a family or getting married. So why is that?
The primary fetish that I have is called breast expansion. It is a fantasy of macromastia and gigantomastia. The breasts begin development, but as the breasts develop, there is no off switch.
We do have a BDSM relationship referred to as daddy and little girl. It's not just sexual, it's really a lifestyle for us.
But for me, I just enjoy getting beat up by women.
My fetish that's outside the norm, I'd have to be power play. I do definitely enjoy having people that are stationed underneath me, which is funny because originally I was trained as a slave.
The woman's breasts become so large that she can no longer move, and that is the tipping point.
I am the disciplinarian, I am the authoritarian, but I'm also the provider, the protector.
It's a release for me.
My fetish is just the visual, the anticipation, and the lingerie, and when it slowly starts to unravel or come off. Yeah.
Whew, I just lost my breath over that last one. Okay, let me assure you, I am not going to tackle this subject matter alone. I need another scientist here.
My name is Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute. I study the science of sexual fantasies and publish the book Tell Me What You Want. I also run a blog called Sex and Psychology at sexandpsychology.com.
One of the things I think I heard you say in one of your talks is that, we all have unfulfilled fantasies. And part of our problem is that we don't have the ability to express our unfulfilled fantasies to make them a reality. Can you talk a bit about that?
Sure. I published a book recently called Tell Me What You Want that was based on the largest and most comprehensive survey of sexual fantasies in the United States. Surveyed more than 4,000 people ranging in age from 18 to 87, coming from all 50 states. And I asked them about their favorite sexual fantasy of all time, as well as hundreds of people, places, and things they might have ever fantasized about. And one of the things I looked at was, for their favorite fantasy, have they ever shared this with a partner, and have they ever acted on it? And if so, what were their experiences like? And what I found was that 80% of people said that their favorite sexual fantasy was something that they wanted to act on. But only about half of people had ever shared that fantasy with a partner, and only about 20% had ever acted on the fantasy.
Why do you think we evolved to have sexual fantasy in our brains?
I think it's interesting when we look at all of the different functions that sexual fantasies serve in our lives. I think fantasies are perfectly normal in the sense that almost everybody has them, and they're very adaptive because they help us to deal with lots of different things in our lives. So, for example, you can look at fantasies through the lens of helping us to cope with previous traumas that we've endured. So one of the things I see in my research is that, for example, people who have a history of sexual victimization have some differences in their sexual fantasies compared to people who don't. And part of that is a way that they are going back and psychologically taking control over a situation where they didn't have control, right? So fantasies can be adaptive in that sense.
In fact, this listener told us they actually healed from trauma with the love and support of the BDSM community.
But I was gritting through it. And I was like, I know I'm safe here. And it was a very weird mental battle because I was very quickly thrown back into being physically hurt and being abused. But at the same time, I knew I was in a safe space and these people would protect me. And if at some point I need to stop, they will do so. And actually, there was a point where I was snarling almost because of the pain. I was trying, but I wasn't saying no. I wasn't saying stop because I wanted to get through it. And the sub next to me held my hand and she was looking at me really, really seriously. And the second mistress stopped and looked at me and she said, okay, she's done. And they quickly got me off of my knees, which were numb at this point, wrapped me in a blanket, got me some water. And the men who had been bystanding, several of them stayed to make sure I was okay. And everyone was like, you okay? You feeling all right? What are your emotions right now? And I had never felt so loved and so safe. And it made all the difference and really did heal some old wounds. So being in the BDSM community can actually do a lot for someone who has past trauma, and they can put over those old memories new ones that are safe and fulfilling and happy.
We see a lot of individual differences in the ways that people cope with trauma. And some people cope with them in more productive ways than others. And people create very different fantasy scenarios as a way of dealing with previous trauma. So, for example, for some people who have been sexually victimized, their fantasies become very emotionless, where the fantasy is just focused on a specific physical act and there's no emotional intimacy, where they're totally distancing themselves from the situation. Whereas other people have fantasies that very much involve being validated and desired and wanted. And so the way that they're coping with it is by, in their mind, constructing this scenario that provides this sense of belongingness and being wanted and needed. So different people cope in different ways. And I think part of that might come down to attachment style and some of these other factors. But I think it's so interesting to look at this vast diversity in fantasies and the way that we construct them.
When Dr. Lehmiller talks about attachment style, he's referring to the well-researched area of psychology called attachment theory. In a nutshell, we all come into the world with a genetic predisposition to crave a certain degree of closeness or have anxiety around abandonment or avoidance of too much closeness. Then our genes get shaped by early childhood experiences, how our caregivers responded to our needs. The combination of genes and early life attachment care then become our belief system for what love is. Psychologists call it our working model for love, because we work hard to find or manipulate partners to fit into our personal schema for love. All this is mostly unconscious, of course. But if you find that you continually are attracted to the same kind of person, you might want to investigate your romantic attachment style. Do sex therapists use fantasy work to help people heal from their traumas?
They do. And this is something that I actually do as part of my work. I travel around the country teaching continuing education courses on sexual fantasies to sex therapists. People come in wanting to know, am I normal or not? And all of these other sorts of questions about their fantasies.
You know, as primates, Homo sapiens have the widest range of sexual behavior of any primate species. Do you think in our culture today, there's a pressure because with pornography and how much sexuality is used in commerce to sell products, For those that are on the end of the scale where they may not be as sexual in behavior or fantasy, do you think there's a pressure to be more sexual?
That is something that I've certainly seen and observed among certain groups of people, where they do feel various pressures that come from the media, that come from pornography. And we live in this culture where sex is all around us, and we think that everybody's doing it all the time. And the media and porn can give us these very wrong ideas about not just what a normal body looks like, but what the right way to have sex is, or how consent works, or what is pleasurable. And I think that creates a lot of problematic expectations and beliefs about sex. And that all gets back to this need for adequate sex education to correct those myths and misconceptions. And also just to help people understand that there's so much diversity in human sexuality. And it's okay if you want to have sex all the time. It's okay if you don't really want to have it at all, right? There's a whole spectrum. And no matter where you fall on it, probably pretty normal.
Do you think part of the reason we evolved to have fantasies was to help couples stay together long enough for offspring to get up on their feet so they could practice monogamy? We know fantasy is very important for long-term monogamy. Do you think it has an evolutionary advantage?
It could. And one of the things that I find in my research is that the one person who appears in your fantasies more than anyone else is your romantic partner. So most people, regardless of gender, sexual orientation, they fantasize about their partners more than they do anyone else. I think that's something that a lot of us can take comfort in. I think a lot of people view fantasies as this way that people are trying to escape their relationships, to replace their partners. But more often than not, our partners are a part of our fantasies, and that could have an evolutionary basis. Sexual arousal tends to reduce our disgust impulses. So some have argued that we evolved to have our disgust responses decrease during sex because sex can be kind of messy. There's this exchange of bodily fluids. And so when we become highly sexually aroused, people are less likely to be grossed out by something that would normally turn them off. So the byproduct of this is that this decrease in disgust responses could open the door to developing fetishes. Because if you're in this heightened state of arousal, disgust is lower, and you happen to be surrounded by something that is typically considered to be disgusting, and then you have this powerful orgasm, that can lead positive reinforcement to kick in, where you then want to repeat that again in the future, and that can lay the basis for fetishes. So I view fetishes as having this combined sort of evolutionary and learning component to them. So I thought it was so interesting in my data that I found that only 7% of my participants said that they fantasize about celebrities and famous figures often, right? So most of the time we're not picturing the rich and famous, these people who are unattainable and who have perfect bodies. I think a big part of the reason we're fantasizing about our partners more than anyone else is because there's this big emotional component to most of our sexual fantasies. And whether people consciously recognize it or not, there's usually some deeper psychological need that's being met in your fantasies. So for example, if you think about a threesome, which is what I find is the most common sexual fantasy, most people probably think about a threesome as, the appeal of it is that there's all these extra bodies and genitals around, and it gives you more options for things to do. But when I look at the way people describe threesomes, most people want to be the center of attention, which suggests that there's this deeper need to be wanted and desired and validated.
And served.
Yes. And, the way that we view a sexual encounter and the stereotypes and other ideas that we have about it are often very different from the reality of the underlying dynamics that are going on there. So you might think that the submissive partner is not, doesn't have power. They're actually the ones holding all the cards.
And it was the first or second time that we were in a hotel room, just kind of rolling around with the sheets and touching each other, that I found myself rising above him and responding to his very deep submissiveness. And I was like, whoa, what is this? And that was my first sub. I very quickly realized that even though I like to serve people, this was my place. I served people by taking care of them and being the commanding voice, but also the person who listened and was the gentle leader. And it was an incredible sort of, wow, this is who I am sort of moment, and explained a lot of things of why do I enjoy helping people and serving people, but also I enjoy this commanding moment. It's because I'm a mother in several different ways. I am a motherly figure. I I am the person who takes care of those who need someone to take care of them.
We should stop and define the differences between fantasies and fetishes here. Fantasies are a story of sexual behavior that we invent in our heads. We may wish to act it out, and some people certainly enjoy doing so. Fetishes are objects, body parts, or behaviors that become part of our arousal system. Some people have trouble getting aroused without them. Others just think about them and become aroused.
People can develop them for almost anything. The most common types of fetishes that I've seen in my work and that I've seen in other research tend to revolve around feet, shoes, boots, and other footwear.
What is up with the foot thing? Tell me, please.
I get asked this question all the time, is why do people eroticize feet? And there are some different theories on it. I don't know that we know for sure where the foot fetish comes from. You know, some have argued that there might be a neurological explanation where the sensory receptors for the feet and the genitals are in close proximity in the brain, and maybe there's some cross-wiring that occurs. That's something I've heard. I don't know whether there's any truth to it or not. Other things I've heard are more sociocultural, whereby, for example, women, we see their feet and footwear are highly sexualized, right? We consider women wearing high heels to be very sexy and attractive. And so we've created these cultural associations between feet and sex appeal. And so that might create the basis for people to develop this sexual association with feet. Some of the other really common fetishes involve things like rubber and latex and lycra, it's spandex, right? So that often takes the form of leggings or pantyhose or other things like that. Those tend to be the more common types of things that we see. Less commonly, we see this whole range of things. For example, people might be turned on by medical equipment, like stethoscope fetishes are a thing, or some people are turned on by dirt or cars, right? So it runs a whole spectrum, but more commonly it's in the area of clothing and footwear type related fetishes that we see.
You keep saying you got something for
Remember Nancy Sinatra strutting the stage wearing nothing but a sweater and those boots that were made for walking? The 1966 #1 music hit contained lyrics that warned philandering men that she was the kind of woman who would walk away from a bad relationship. But the images of Sinatra and her background singers might have also led a generation of young men to have a footwear fetish.
One of these days, these boots are gonna walk all over you.
I knew a man once who had a very narcissistic mother, but she allowed him, as a little boy, to give her pedicures. And surprise, surprise, he has a foot thing.
And certainly with a lot of fetishes, you can trace them back to early childhood experiences. And we see this in a lot of case reports in the literature where people with feet, shoe, and other footwear fetishes can think of an event usually around the time of puberty that involved feet or shoes in some way. And it could have been that they were just exploring shoes in their parents' closet or something. But I think the interesting thing there is that a lot of these fetishes are tied to events around puberty, which is when people develop their first, they have their sexual awakening and hormones are raging.
Are there some fantasies that are more popular than others?
There are endless numbers of fantasies that people can have. But what I found when I looked through people's favorite fantasy of all time was that there were 7 primary themes that emerged. The first of these was multi-partner sex, most commonly threesomes. Second was power control and rough sex, all of the BDSM stuff.
I have found I have a very, very strong thing when it comes to biting and clawing people.
The third was what I call novelty, adventure, and variety, where people are just going out and trying something that's new and different for them. Most commonly, that's just taking sex outside of your own bed in your own bedroom. So having sex in a new setting or experimenting with sex toys. Beyond that, we start to see things like taboos. So doing something that is socially or culturally forbidden is a very popular type of fantasy. Then we have the non-monogamy fantasies where people want to be in a relationship where they have the opportunity to have more than one partner. This is different from group sex because it's more about the structure of the relationship rather than having, say, an orgy.
Like if I just had a male partner, it wouldn't work. And if I just had a female partner, it wouldn't work. So I was like, okay, what do I do with this? So that's how I end up going for couples.
Then we have the passion and romance and other emotional fulfillment fantasies where people are trying to meet some deeper emotional need through their fantasy. And then lastly, we have the gender bending and homoeroticism fantasies, where people are sort of pushing the boundaries and limits of their gender role or sexual orientation.
In case you didn't recognize it, that was YMCA, the 1978 musical hit by the Village People that you can't say, you can only sing. That group pried many heteronormative eyes wide open. While most people have never acted out their fantasies and might be happier if they did, some fantasies, according to Leigh Miller, are best kept tucked in our heads.
The fantasy I found that was actually least likely to turn out well was group sex. So it's interesting because that's the
Surprise.
It's interesting because it's the most common fantasy, but it's the one that's least likely to turn out well. I think the real issue is that people don't have a script for a group sex scenario and how it goes. They understand two-person sex, but when you start adding in other people and bodies, it's who's supposed to do what with whom and when. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and that's compounded by the fact that we have poor sexual communication. And so how do you navigate that type of situation? And then another layer of difficulty in these situations is that many people enter them with a current partner, and they didn't think ahead as to how they would actually feel when they see their partner getting attention from somebody else. And some people start to experience jealousy or insecurity. And so you've got all of these unexpected emotions that often pop up as well.
And how about that so-called rape fantasy? The one that popular culture and the porn industry seem to completely misunderstand.
One of the more common BDSM type fantasies that I saw in my data was what I call a forced sex fantasy. Some people refer to these as rape fantasies, but I don't really like that terminology because what's happening in these fantasies is not representative of or a reflection of sexual assault in the real world. Because in a forced sex fantasy, the fantasizer is in control, whereas in a real life sexual assault, that person doesn't have control. But what I found in my research was that more than half of women, men, and people who had non-binary gender identities had fantasized about being forced to have sex before. And I thought this was so interesting because in a lot of the previous research on forced sex fantasies, actually in all the previous research, it's only focused on women. And people have talked about how that is a very common desire for women, but I find that it's actually common across the gender spectrum. And it's also interesting because I asked people about fantasies on the flip side of that, about forcing somebody else to have sex. And what I found was that men were more likely to have those fantasies than women, but the majority of men and women had never had that fantasy. So it's much more common for people to fantasize about sexual submission than it is for them to fantasize about sexual dominance. And in these fantasies, people often describe themes of token resistance, right? Where, you know, they're in the fantasy forcing sex on somebody else who actually really wants to have sex, or they're being forced to have sex, but it's on their terms with the partner of their choosing, and it unfolds according to the scenario that they've envisioned. So these are fundamentally consensual scenarios.
I have also heard that it's one of the most common human fantasies. Do you think there's any evolutionary roots to this?
So some people have argued for an evolutionary explanation, and in particular, the arguments I've seen have tried to explain why women have so many rape fantasies or forced sex fantasies through an evolutionary lens. But the fact that I'm seeing they're so common among men doesn't really fit with the explanations that I've seen through that evolutionary lens, right? Where they're sort of talking about how women evolved to be more submissive sexually or to cope with the realities of these power dynamics where women historically have less social power than men do. So, you know, I've seen those explanations, but I don't know that they make sense with the data that I have.
With all this talk about normative fetishes and fantasies, part of the reason why fetishes and fantasies can get a bad rap is because they also can be disabling and sometimes fall into a category of a mental diagnosis contained in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. This category is called paraphilias. Paraphilias are recurrent, intense, sexually arousing fantasies, urges, or behaviors that are, and this is the important part, distressing or disabling. They can cause significant anguish in people's social or work lives. They may involve inanimate objects, non-consenting adults, or even children, or the suffering or humiliation of oneself or their partner with the potential to cause real harm. Diagnosable paraphilias include pedophilia, voyeurism, exhibitionism, sexual masochism disorder, and sexual sadism disorder. As you can probably guess, some paraphilias are the root causes of sexual assaults. They are clearly illegal and can result in imprisonment and lifetime registration as a sex offender. Even therapists have been reluctant to treat some of these patients because the stigma in our culture is so great. However, a few modern-day clinicians, in an attempt to prevent crimes against children, are learning to treat what they call minor attracted adults, to help those adults work through the early life trauma they may have that resulted in this dangerous attraction. One such therapist, Nicoletta von Heidinger, a Los Angeles-based sexologist, was a guest on my iHeartRadio show. She told me that after this interview, she was contacted by some people currently living in incarceration who had wished they could have been treated by her before they committed their crime.
You can't change someone's sexuality, but you can challenge them to not act on fantasies that they have that will be harmful to others.
And you can also add more things to the menu that they might choose, right?
Some research that we do have says that the biggest indicator of acting on it is age, meaning the older that you get, the more likelihood there is to act on it. And that seems to stem from what social isolation and shame does to a person.
Mm-hmm.
And lack of resources.
And that made an even bigger fist in my gut right there. Oh! Sadly, some of these offenders may also have significant personality disorders, like antisocial personality or narcissism, which can make treatment especially difficult. But there's another reason why so many fetishes and fantasies have a bad rap. Hollywood has presented them in a titillating way, but forgot to include sexual consent. Let's start with 1967's The Graduate, where a much older married woman, played by Anne Bancroft, lives out her fantasy of sex with a 21-year-old college graduate, played by Dustin Hoffman, using alcohol and emotional manipulation as weapons.
I mean, you didn't really think I'd do something like that.
Like what?
What do you think?
Well, I don't know.
For God's sake, Mrs. Robinson. Here we are. You got me into your house. You give me a drink. You put on music. Now you start opening up your personal life to me and tell me your husband won't be home for hours.
So?
Mrs. Robinson, you're trying to seduce me.
Then in 1986, Mickey Rourke played a Wall Street dealmaker who coerces an art gallery employee, played by Kim Basinger, into a 9.5-week relationship that involved some light fetishes like blindfolds and cross-dressing, but then a sexual assault. In the following scene, the gift of a gold watch set to daily masturbation time was the beginning of his emotional manipulation.
Elizabeth, each day at 12 o'clock, would you look at that watch and think of me touching you?
Yes.
Then in 2015, Hollywood did it again with a trio of films based on the novel 50 Shades of Grey. It starred Dakota Johnson as Anastasia Steele, a college graduate who begins a sadomasochistic relationship with a young business magnate, Christian Grey, played by Jamie Dornan. As fun as it may seem initially, can you tell when the situation becomes dangerous?
Do you want to punish me right now?
Yes. I want to punish you right now.
What if I told you that I feel the same way about being punished as you do about me touching you? Would you still want to punish me then?
No. But that doesn't mean I wouldn't need to.
Why?
Anna, stop.
Why do you need to?
Because it's the way I am!
Taken in its totality, the movie never really asked for clear sexual consent. Viewers may think that both 9.5 Weeks and 50 Shades are romantic and sexy, but they also misunderstand the nature of these relationships. Both movies depict sexual abuse, not the living out of a BDSM fantasy. School's in. Time to put on my Professor Walsh cap. Sexual consent has 4 rules. Number 1, only yes means yes. Uh-huh doesn't mean yes. Doesn't mean yes. Maybe doesn't mean yes. Even a text doesn't mean yes. Verbally saying the word yes is sexual consent. Number 2, it's your responsibility to know that you have consent. Number 3, nothing you've ever done gives you permission to do the next thing. Yeah, you have to keep asking for consent. Number 4, if you've been drinking alcohol, you can't give sexual consent. And there are a few more wise rules that people use in the BDSM community. For instance, the activity must be safe, sane, and consensual. You must use a safe word. That's a word that you use during play that literally means stop, even if you say something like purple. You can't ever play under the influence of alcohol. And if you do use knots, it has to make the person feel like they're being constrained, but yet they can break free from in an emergency. Okay, now that the lessons are over, let's get back to your fantasies and why they tend to stay tucked in your head. The Kinsey Institute's Dr. Justin Lehmiller has some theories.
So there's this really big gap between fantasy and reality where we have these things that we want to do, that we very much want to act on in our sex lives, that we're thinking about all the time, but that we're not necessarily sharing with our intimate partners, the people who know us well, the people that we're having sex with. And the vast majority of us are never acting on those fantasies either. And there's a whole range of reasons people aren't doing it, but they really stem from a lack of knowledge about how do I go about even doing this? And then also communication issues, like how do I even bring this up to a partner? And also what will my partner say? So there's a lot of fear about being shamed or judged for your sexual desires. And that's really one of the big things that holds people back. What's interesting is that when I look at the people who have shared their fantasy with a partner and I ask them, what was that experience like? Most people actually report positive outcomes and say that their partner responded favorably to it and that it improved the relationship. And so that suggests that your partner probably isn't going to be as judgmental as you think they are. So the people who are sharing, the people who are acting on their fantasies, by and large are reporting positive outcomes, but the people who aren't sharing and acting on their fantasies just have it in their minds that it's not going to go well.
Scientists guess that humans have evolved to use their imaginations for survival, longevity, or maybe even just to make life, sex, procreation more fun. Again, like so much, it comes down to sexual communication, learning how to be authentic, honest, and vulnerable in your relationships. And if you're rejected for being you, are you really with the right person? Of course, only you can answer that. But the added bonus of emotional intimacy is that it tends to be the glue that keeps couples together for a long time. Thanks for listening to this episode of Mating Matters. I'm Dr. Wendy Walsh with producer Brooke Peterson. Mating Matters is produced in partnership with iHeartMedia. It is researched, interviewed, and written by me, Dr. Wendy Walsh, and it is edited and produced by Brooke Peterson. You know, people don't learn about podcasts usually by just searching around. They learn about a podcast because somebody who loved that podcast told them about it. So I encourage you to please subscribe, write a review, and more than anything, hit that share button now. Thanks for listening. I'm Dr. Wendy Walsh. If you'd like to contact us, we'd love to hear from you. You can call the Mating Matters voicemail at 323-207-8277. Or you can record a voice memo and email it to us at matingmatters@iheartmedia.com.
Hi, this is Brooke. You have probably already guessed this, but on this episode of Mating Matters, the voice of one or more guests have been altered to protect their identity.
Unfortunately, my introduction into BDSM and the kink community was how a number of people's are, especially if they are women. I was in a very abusive relationship, and he used BDSM to abuse me. So I had to relearn what real BDSM is, because BDSM is not abuse. The 3 core principles of BDSM are safe, sane, and consensual. But basically, if someone says no, then no means no. And if you did not properly explain to someone what you're about to do and how you're going to do it, then they cannot have properly consented to what you're about to do. With abuse, it's just done to you. You didn't ask for it, or if you did ask for it, maybe you didn't realize you didn't want it. At any point during kinky stuff or fetishy stuff of any sort, you can always say, hey, whoa, I don't want this anymore. And it's over. It's done. You have to stop if someone says stop.
Have you read the books 50 Shades of Grey? And if so, what do you think about them?
Oh, good Lord. I did not read the books. I slowly learned about the extreme controversy surrounding it. It doesn't seem like he goes and gets her consent. I've seen a couple of different people's takes on it. My favorite take is if you read it and there were some things you found in it that you liked as a fictional work, as a fantasy work, great. You know, we really can't fault something that gets people in the door as long as people do look at it like any other fictional book that might portray rape as something amazing. It is fiction. It is very, very, very much fiction.
If you or a loved one has experienced sexual assault and would like to talk to someone, call the National Sexual Assault Hotline. Their number is 800-656-HOPE. That's 800-656-4673. Or you can go online for live chat 24/7 at online.rainn.org. That's online.rainn.org. The sound was pretty good, eh?